On this channel, we're always talking about corruption, how power operates, the inability of ordinary people to influence what governments do, to affect their relationships with big business. In this episode, we're looking at my conversation with Carne Ross, former government insider turned whistleblower, who tells us explicitly how government operates and, importantly, talks about what solutions we may deploy, and it gives us a chance to imagine a different world altogether if you're sick and tired of the way things are.
I was very heavily involved in the Iraq WMD issue. I helped set up the Weapons Inspection Agency, the UN Weapons Inspection Agency. I was deeply versed in the intelligence about WMD.
Carne Ross worked with the British government and intelligence services some time ago and was in government at the time of the Iraq War, speaking about his experiences working that closely with people in power in this important episode of history, where we found out really the kind of decisions that are made, what information will be used and neglected in order for government imperatives to be met, the implications or ramifications, of which are still being felt to this day. Here he is talking about that.
And so I was extremely familiar with the case that the government was making for war, and knew immediately that its case was, to put it politely, grossly exaggerated. But also, and I think this was an important thing that's often ignored, that the government had ignored alternatives to war. And that's a basic moral requirement of war, that it's only the last resort. And I had written papers on what an alternative to war might be. And so I knew that the government, had not taken those seriously.
All of us know that there were lies around the weapons of mass destruction situation, but to hear someone who worked in the government speaking from a human perspective about the way that power operates, I think this is a unique insight. And some of the conclusions Carne comes to as a result of his time there, for me, are fascinating. This is taken from a conversation that I was had on my podcast, Under the Skin, that's available on Luminary. This episode actually is free on YouTube, but I really recommend you subscribe to Luminary if you're interested in hearing conversations like this about the nature of power and the philosophies of power.
The experience of being around people in government, ministers, prime ministers, presidents, that's one of the reasons I became an anarchist, because I think it's all a bit of a myth that these folks are really impressive and competent and know what they're doing. A lot of them are very well-intentioned people. A lot of them are competent, but we put them on a pedestal and we want to believe they are heroic, that they have some kind of access to truth and reason that the rest of us don't have. And I never really saw that.
Well, I think it's fascinating about what Carne Ross is saying there and his conclusion to become an anarchist. And just to unpack that for a moment, anarchism doesn't mean chaos. It means centralized power is abolished and democracy is practiced at every level of decision making. That's what he means by anarchism there. And it's a conclusion he reached as a result of experiencing the ordinariness and the limitation of even well-intentioned people within government. What I felt as a result of conversations like this and my conversation with Yanis Varoufakis, for example, is that the systems themselves are so intransigent and bent on particular imperatives that no amount of change of personnel within them systems is going to make a meaningful difference to ordinary people. It doesn't matter if you have the Democrats or the Conservatives or the Republicans or New Labour or whoever. What you're going to end up with in those systems is the kind of results that we're used to over the last 50 years and perhaps beyond that if you have a deep historical knowledge.
I began to think that it's constructed on ideas which are not humane, the idea of national interests, which are by their very nature regarded as amoral. States are allowed to do things that individuals are not allowed to do. Above all, commit violence. States have a monopoly of violence.
This conversation with Carne Ross is where I understood a really important thing about power, that all laws are underwritten by the idea of violence. This is something that we've also discussed with Brad Evans, a brilliant guest on Under the Skin. For example, take something simple like, I'm going to park where I want, right? I'm just going to park where I want. Well, this is a no parking zone. We'll put a ticket on your car. I'm not going to pay that parking fine. You will get a court summons. I'm not going to turn up to court on that day. Some people knocking on the door. I'm not going to open the door. The door's getting broken down. I'm not coming with you. They're taking you. So whilst law and legislation is, of course, by its nature necessary to maintain order, it does a lot more than that. It is the implication of violence. You're handing over your volition, your autonomy to a secondary power, which Carne points out there are not restricted by the kind of moral parameters that we usually live within. We don't practice violence. If you do, it's considered a crime and you go to prison. A state has the right to practice violence, yes, in order to protect you, but ultimately, if you step out of a line with the state's agenda, in order to incarcerate you.
I reject the state-based system because I saw it from the inside, and I saw what it's capable of, and I saw the way it made people behave. And I think one of the most disturbing things I felt about it was that, you know, I wanted to regard people like me and my colleagues as decent people. And in many ways, they are decent people. I thought of myself as a decent person. And yet you are put in a framework that allows you to do terrible things. And this is the history of moral crimes is usually people are put in circumstances that makes them behave badly. People are not innately evil. They wouldn't otherwise choose to do evil things. But you put even decent people in the kind of circumstance and structure where they can do bad things, and bad things follow.
Hannah Arendt's work unpacks that articulately and continues to be influential to this day. Her analysis of the Nazis and the concentration camps that were run by them point out that the crimes were committed by ordinary people doing extraordinarily evil things. Her famous phrase, the banality of evil, describes this. Now, whilst I'm not suggesting that all governments are as extreme as that great blemish on humanity, the Third Reich and the Holocaust, regardless, systemic power and systemic abuse remains a problem. It takes away individual autonomy. It takes away your ability to make individual decisions. You are inhibited, prohibited, controlled by the role that you play within a system. Why I like this conversation with Carne Ross is it illustrates to me, from the perspective of an insider, something that I've long felt. You will not get real change from within those systems. They are built a certain way, they behave in a particular way. If you want meaningful change, not reform, although reform has of course led to comparatively good things, if you want real change, systemic change is what you have to focus on.
9/11 changed my life fundamentally, but also I think profoundly unsettled me, as it did for so many people. It was an epic failure of the sort of thing I was paid to do. You know, I was our Middle East expert at the UN Security Council, and we utterly failed in the state's basic duty, which was to protect the population. And then once that failure had happened, I saw the state, in particular Washington, construct a new way to legitimize itself by finding an enemy, almost any enemy, in order to prove its necessity to a population that was otherwise would doubt its need for a state that had failed to protect it. And I saw the construction of that narrative from the very beginning. I was with the US government right after 9/11, and for the days following, I went to the State Department for weeks afterwards to talk about Iraq, and we saw how the narrative on Iraq began to shift, and I saw my own government go with it and fail to question it. And it was an extraordinary experience to see how a government and a state adapted itself to a circumstance where it was required to prove itself. And I realized that states behave in a way that isn't rational, that is ultimately driven by a need to prove the necessity of their own existence.
In a sense, the only thing I would argue with there that Carne Ross said is that their behaviour isn't rational. It is rational if the incentive is perpetuation of the system and preservation of the system. I like hearing from someone who's been present for a significant historical event, has watched it unfold, has seen the response. I like the way this challenges important philosophical ideas about the role of the state, the presentation of the state as our protector, but the reality of the state as our persecutor, our controller. Now, in the interceding, 10, 20 years, I'm not very good with time, look at what's going on now. Look at the amount of power that governments have during this pandemic, the power and authority to keep us on lockdown, the power and authority to track and trace, the power and authority to do deals with big tech that's going to mean that we're being observed in ways that we've never been observed before, that huge sums of money are going to be handed over to the private sector to run previously public utilities. Carne Ross is sounding a warning bell from the heart of the system that this isn't about, it might be better if you vote for a more liberal or a more conservative type candidate. in a sense, we have to withdraw from conventional politics. We have to establish new political models. This is something, that I've understood then. And even when Carne Ross was teaching me that, I'd heard other people explain this kind of stuff to me. But their lessons are still relevant because none of these solutions are being reached for, because whether it's the media, big business, or the government, no one in these positions is interested in bringing about change, because their objective, as Carne Ross explains there, is self-preservation. If you want real change, you'll have to establish new systems.
And this is what anarchists think about all institutions, is that institutions ultimately have their own sets of interests, which are ulterior. And the state is one such institution. Above all, states and the people who work in it, and I knew this because I had worked in it, want to feel that they are necessary. And sometimes they have to prove it. And war, I'm afraid to say, is one of the ultimate ways that the state proves its necessity.
We did a video recently on Joe Biden and the forever war, the distinction between Joe Biden's campaign promises and his actions in offices. We do videos about the Great Reset, the relationships between big tech and the state, about how these relationships prevent ordinary people having privacy or power. This is something that's been experienced firsthand by Carne Ross. It's a wonderful episode of Under the Skin. I recommend you watch all of it, but also there's brilliant episodes with Naomi Klein, Joel Backham. This is a deeper dive into subjects that you are interested in.
It's the Hobbesian bargain that we all make with the state. It's based on a premise that other people are not to be trusted, that without authority we would return to a state of nature which is essentially violent.
That's a powerful assumption about the nature of human beings in itself, isn't it? That we are malevolent. It's a cynical worldview. So whether you're, again, a Democrat or Republican, a liberal or a conservative, the worldview that abides is that human beings need to be controlled, that we're incapable of controlling ourselves. And that suggests a kind of malevolence, and that optimism about the human condition is regarded as a sort of naivety. Oh, you're very naive. Well, of course I know that human beings are capable, and forget human beings, that I am capable of doing things that are led by appetite. But our individual struggles are about finding our own harmony with the best version of ourselves. Would it not be better to live in communities and systems that are about enhancing those values, supporting those values, acknowledging that people are flawed and fallible, but where possible, creating the conditions for human beings to thrive and cooperate? What we have now is increasing oligarchy and an inability for ordinary people to really have any impact on their own lives. Look, I know I'm in a Western country and I'm wearing a great cardigan and I've got a laptop and all that kind of stuff, but look at the way the wind blows. Look at the way things have changed since this interview, like 5 years ago. Look at what's happening right now, and envisage, if you can, with the rate of change increasing all the time, where we could be in 5-10 years with the sort of legislation that's being passed and the kind of decisions that are being made today.
Real anarchy of a violent kind, where we'd all kill each other, where life is nasty, brutish and short, as Hobbes put it. And I don't believe that people are really like that, and that the claim that we have to have coercive authority to control us to stop that happening, I think is at best an untested claim. And at worst, it's an utter fallacy which we're foolish to believe.
I suppose that's why I bang on about spirituality a lot, because spirituality, I suppose, has a few principles in it, sort of vaguely speaking, and how else can you speak about such matters? We are all interconnected. We have a common destiny together. The values we should be promoting are kindness, cooperation, togetherness, unity, service, humility. Basic, simple, nursery rhyme stuff, really, but things that are forgotten. But all of them are undergirded by the idea that we as human beings are basically decent or capable of decency, not incapable of it. Not that the only thing that's holding us back from becoming savage beasts and monsters is a sort of a draconian and authoritarian state. If the solution is worse than the problem, then, as has been brought up around other issues, then you need to look at the solution.
After 9/11, you saw people in New York behave in a way that was extraordinary and tremendously moving, and the diametric opposite of the way the government was behaving. The government was saying threat, aggression, we must take revenge. The people, as far as I saw, including, survivors from the disaster, from the attacks, behaved with tremendous compassion. And it was a profoundly moving thing to witness. And, one of the experiences I am most moved by is the experience of soldiers in war. Why is it that people in war experience this intense comradeship? Why does it require war for us to feel like that? Why can't we have that feeling of comradeship and absolute solidarity with each other and total loyalty and a willingness to sacrifice without the need for war? What is it about the structure of our current political and economic circumstance that makes that so unlikely?
I suppose because the fact is that in war, abominable though it seems to me as a person that's never participated in it, conditions are created for unity. We have drifted in our culture, in our civilization, so far from our nature. I mean, in a basic anthropological sense, small communities of interdependency and service in harmony with our nature, that it takes an anathema, it takes an anomaly, it takes a dark event like war for us to awaken to who we are. In Sebastian Junger's brilliant book Tribe, he talks about how if you were trying to create a civilization for maximum negative impact on mental health and peace of mind, you couldn't do a lot better than the dystopia we are creating and with ever increasing speed moving towards. He talks also about the cohesion, togetherness and unity in war and the grief of many returning veterans at the loss of the sense of purpose, meaning and togetherness that experience brings about in them. If you enjoyed this video, then consider having a look at Under the Skin. This video, as I say, is free on YouTube anyway, so you can see the whole thing. But if you want more conversations like it, conversations with Jordan Peterson, Naomi Klein, and coming up soon we've got conversations with Edward Snowden, Glenn Greenwald, Vandana Shiva. All these conversations are coming up on Under the Skin. If you enjoyed this, you should subscribe. You'll enjoy it if you can afford it. Otherwise, sign up to my mailing list on russellbrand.com. Like this video and turn on the notification bell if you can stand to, and write a comment because we really try and respond to those comments. Get on the mailing list, participate, join in. Let's create this beautiful new anarchist utopia that this wonderful gentleman is describing. Thanks.